Can a police officer or detective testify at a trial as a non-expert witness that the defendant is the person that appears in surveillance video or photo? To find out, you have to read People versus Mosley, but it's 25 pages. Don't have time for that? I've got you covered. This is TLDR, Too Long Didn't Read, where I cover New York Court of Appeals cases and I try to do it in 5 minutes or less. This is the episode of the case of People versus Mosley. The citation for this case is 2024 New York Slip Opinion 02125, published by the New York Court of Appeals on April 23rd of 2024. The issue in this case is whether a non-eyewitness to a crime can testify to a jury that the defendant can identify the defendant as the person depicted in a video or photo. To understand and appreciate the context of this case, it's helpful background information to understand the difference between an expert witness and a lay witness. An expert witness is qualified by reason of their education, training, and experience, but you're also allowed to elicit opinion of lay witnesses. A lay witness can give an opinion or inference when the testimony is, and this is the rules, rationally based on a witness's personal perception and within the ambit of common experience or of a particular witness by their experience. And 3 would be helpful to the finder of fact in understanding the witness's testimony or determining a fact and issue. That's the general rules that are found in 7.03, opinion by a lay witness in the Guide to New York Evidence. And a testimony that meets that criteria can be admitted even if it embraces the ultimate issue to be resolved by the jury. So what do we have in this case? The facts are that on June 10th of 2015 in Syracuse, New York, police cameras captured in grainy video a man running through the streets of Syracuse and firing 3 shots into a van. The van then drove off. Responding officers recovered 2 bullet casings but did not see the shooter. The grand jury then indicted the defendant, Mr. Mosley, for the shooting in 2015, but it was dismissed as legally insufficient. Later on, in July of 2016, as the prosecutor's office is preparing to re-indict the defendant, an ADA showed the video, that grainy video that captured the incident, to Detective Kilburn, who then identified from that grainy video the defendant as the shooter. He said, "I recognize that that's the defendant," and repeated that identification to the grand jury, who then indicted the defendant. The case went to trial in February of 2018, and the key disputed issue in this case is identification. Defendant's defense is, "It's not me." The video was the only evidence tying the defendant to the crime. At trial, the people placed the video in evidence and relied upon Detective Kilburn to prove by lay non-eyewitness testimony, identification testimony, that he believed Mosley was the person depicted in the video as the shooter. And how that worked is outside the presence of the jury, the judge had a little hearing to determine why the detective thought this about the defendant. And he explained that he sat in rooms with the defendant. He walked by his side on occasion, had occasion to speak to him a few times, all in the police precinct. And he also saw photos of the defendant on Facebook and elsewhere. At the time, he testified that at the time the ADA showed him the video, he knew that the defendant had been arrested on a warrant for shots fired and a weapons charge. The judge concluded in that hearing that Detective Kilburn had a sufficient and extensive basis of knowledge to identify the defendant, but instructed the detective to avoid mentioning the unrelated criminal investigation in which he actually met the defendant. The detective then testified in front of the jury that he met the defendant 7 months after the video was shot, testified he's familiar with the defendant's body language, his build, had known him for a year and a half, had interacted with him and walked with him and spoken with him. The detectives testified that even though he didn't know the defendant at the time of the shooting, he based his ID on his interactions with the defendant, his build, the shape of his nose, on previously viewing the video and being able to zoom in on the video. He said the defendant's appearance had not changed, and he appeared the same now in court as he did in the video and when the detective had met him. And ultimately, the jury asked, to see the video. They asked for a magnifying glass to watch the video, which was denied. And ultimately, they found the defendant guilty of 2 counts of CPW2, criminal possession of a weapon in the second degree, and reckless endangerment. The defendant appealed. He said the court abused its discretion in allowing this lay witness, this lay non-eyewitness testimony by Detective Kilburn to identify the defendant. And the appellate division affirmed the trial judge's decision, and it goes to the Court of Appeals. And here, they identify the problems with non-eyewitness identification testimony. They say it invades upon the jury's role. It's the jury's decision whether the defendant did it or not. It draws the jury's attention, theoretically, potentially, to the defendant's prior interactions with police officers. If a detective says, well, I met him in the police precinct, and that gets elicited, it can make the jury think, well, this guy's a criminal, therefore he must be guilty of this. And thirdly, in the effort to mitigate that prejudice of that association with the police, if the judge instructs that you can't get into that prior how he actually knows the defendant, now it impairs the defense attorney's ability to cross-examine that lay witness as to how he knows him, the basis of his familiarity with him, because he'd be so afraid to open the door. Because if you ask questions, well, how many times did you meet with him? Where'd you meet with him? How'd you meet with him? That could theoretically open the door to allowing questions about what the defendant was actually arrested for, why he was previously being investigated by the police. Okay, so here the Court of Appeals issues these new rules. They say, this is the rules that will now govern non-eyewitness lay identification testimony. They say there's a totality of the circumstances test. The court must determine whether the witness has sufficient contacts with the defendant to achieve a level of familiarity that would make the lay opinion helpful. So that's the first part. The court can consider many factors, including the witness's general level of familiarity, whether it's extended over periods of time, the varied experiences, whether the witness was familiar with the defendant's appearance at the time of the surveillance video, whether he's familiar with the defendant's manner of dress and clothing, whether the witness references a specific unique gait or feature like tattoos or scars, whether they can identify that trait in the surveillance video or photo, and whether the jury needs witness assistance. So whether the defendant's appearance appears changed, whether the defendant disguised himself, whether the video is good quality, the extent to which the subject is captured on the video. These are all things that are going to be valid to consider in the totality of the circumstances test. And before admitting lay eyewitness testimony, the court must conduct a separate hearing outside the presence of the jury to address those issues at which the party offering that testimony has the burden, to show that it's helpful and necessary. They have to make a clear record for appellate review. And finally, if they allow it, the court should give cautionary jury instructions that this is ultimately a question for the jury. It's ultimately the jury's determination whether the defendant is that person depicted in the surveillance video. And applying those rules, they find that it was abuse of discretion in this case. That Detective Kilburn did not have sufficient familiarity. It was very grainy video, too blurry. There was no change of appearance or disguise. The cross-examination was very impaired, and the error was not harmless. It was reversible error. The court reverses the conviction, orders a new trial. And that's the case of People versus Mosley. Have a good day. If you like what you just saw and want to see more just like it, please hit like or subscribe to let me know.